Hey, everybody, this is Kenny. Welcome back to another edition of the Leading from the Middle podcast. This is the podcast for middle managers who want to develop themselves, develop their teams, and improve their results. I got to talk to a tremendous leader today. Wait till you hear this conversation. So, business book author, professional speaker, podcaster, entrepreneur, and so much more. Mark Graban joined me today. And Mark's book is called, or at least his last book, is called The Mistakes That Make Us. So just that title alone tells you we're going to have a great conversation as Mark talks about learning from mistakes and how that has helped advance his career in leadership, and what he really bases a foundation now for other leaders is to really cultivate a culture of mistakes. And we don't often do that. Leaders, you don't want to miss a second of this. Let's get at it.
This episode is brought to you by Kitcaster. Kitcaster books you on top podcasts. How do funded startup founders attract prospects and talent? Podcast interviews. How do entrepreneurs with exits find new deals? Podcast interviews. How do C-suite execs differentiate in crowded markets? Podcast interviews. Kitcaster books you on top podcasts. Click the link in the show notes for a special offer. Celebrate good conversation.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to another edition of the Leading from the Middle podcast. I have got a terrific leader with me today, and I love a lot of the topics that he talks about. We're going to focus on one, though, that is from his last book that I found fascinating. And leaders, we really need to hear from him on this. So without further ado, business book author, professional speaker, podcaster, entrepreneur, and more, Mark Graban has joined me today. Mark, it is fantastic to connect with you today. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, Kenny. Thanks for having me here.
Oh, awesome. It is my honor to connect with you and talk to you. Your last book, I'm going to jump right in because I want to get your backstory, but your last book was called The Mistakes That Make Us, Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation. And I'm so fascinated by that. I can't wait to pick up the book and read it because it is really a topic that we don't talk about much. And that's, how do we learn from mistakes? And not just in business. We don't talk about that even in life at times. And so I'm so anxious to hear your backstory and what's led you to do not just this topic, because you talk about a lot of great leadership topics, but what led you to this through your backstory?
Yeah, well, Kenny, this book, it's the culmination of a lot of different career experiences and influences. And before telling you that backstory, I mean, I think part of the reason this topic is so interesting to me is that I think you and I and the listeners, I think individually, we hear this all the time, mistakes or failures or our greatest teachers, our greatest learning opportunities. Like, it's much more likely that individuals can at least begrudgingly accept that. But then somehow organizations, it seems, forget that idea and they demand perfection. They punish human error and mistakes. And so, I think we can challenge ourselves if we're working for leaders who are on board with this idea that we should be learning, from mistakes, and maybe we can explore that more. But, my backstory, Kenny, I'm an industrial engineer. That's my undergraduate degree. I started my career in manufacturing in the auto industry. 20, I'll call it more than 25 years ago. It's almost 30 years ago at General Motors. And in the mid 90s, the message was pretty clear: catch up to Toyota. And a lot of that was trying to emulate the methods from Toyota. And so as I've done work in what's often called lean manufacturing or lean management, this methodology, that really has its roots in the auto industry, but can be applied in so many more settings. A key aspect of that culture is learning from mistakes and understanding that most mistakes are caused by systemic factors. And so it's either unfair or unhelpful to punish individuals who are doing their best in a flawed system. So I've learned from the application of those principles in manufacturing, in healthcare, in software companies. Having this culture of learning from mistakes isn't something that's just for big companies. It's not just for a certain industry. And I've gotten to explore that in different ways over the last, we'll call it almost 30 years,
Right.
kind of, again, not just, I think there are some very practical lessons here about how do we cultivate an environment where people truly can learn from mistakes. That's good for the organization too.
Oh, there's no question. There was so much you said there. I loved it. Why don't we start here? What about your own experience? Where did this really, illuminate in you? Was there a point where you made a mistake and you got crushed for it, and you said, "Wait a second, I know this isn't how it's supposed to be." What was that tipping point for yourself, Mark?
I think it was a number of things. I mean, I have, this habit that I try to work on, and a lot of people share this habit of being too hard on myself when I make a mistake. A lot of that kind of starts within and how that gets to be. Um, Kind of trying to learn how to get better, even just admitting a mistake to yourself, maybe is an early step here. But I've been in workplaces where either directly or indirectly I've been blamed, or I've seen people being blamed and yelled at for stuff that wasn't their fault. And again, it seems unhelpful and counterproductive. There are better ways to react to a mistake where we can focus on learning and improvement. And so I think, over time, a lot of the mentors that I've had help me have been really influential. I think it was a more gradual recognition of this pattern. And I think when it comes to not being too hard on others, I had some kind of gradual reflections even a decade ago. A previous book that I was editor of, it was me and 15 other authors. We did a book called Practicing Lean,
Mm,
and part of the theme of that book was looking back, whether it was 10 or 20 years, to mistakes that we made early in our careers, all of us as contributors to the book, and to kind of reflect on that, and trying to remember not to be too judgmental about others who are now new in their career or their practice of this lean management methodology, of not being too hard on them. And a lot of that was pointed at myself in the mirror. Like, don't be too hard on others in the workplace, on social media, in my writing. And trying to find a balance of, sure, there are times when you might want to try to educate or coach people, but do so in a way that's more helpful than critical. So that was kind of part of my journey of where I think I've made some mistakes, of being too harsh and too critical when others made what I might deem a mistake.
yeah, man, oh man, I love that, and that self reflection is so important. So, let's go down the road of that leader that has gradually done the things you just said. Um, what's the next steps? How do you now take? We'll talk about just the leader themselves first, and then we'll talk about building that culture within the team. But how do you then take what you just said and really now start to work on yourself? What are
Mm,
some things that you can practically do to really learn from those mistakes that we're all going to make?
yeah. Well, I think even just on that individual level, if we don't feel comfortable admitting mistakes to our boss or to our employees, and again, to middle managers who are quite often caught in the middle of
Yeah,
between how they would like to behave and how the leaders or business owner they work for wants them to behave,
yeah,
a tough situation sometimes. But even just thinking individually, here's some things that I found that helped me, at least. One is, again, just like calling out and admitting the mistake, whether it's just in your head or even out loud to yourself, of like, oh, I was wrong. I made a mistake. My bad. Just to acknowledge it, because we make mistakes all the time. I don't think I'm particularly mistake prone,
mhm,
but like when we make a decision, and we make a decision based on the information we have at the moment, we think we're making a good decision, and then maybe seconds, minutes, weeks, months later, we learn, oh, okay, well, based on what I know now, I wouldn't have made that decision. But
mhm.
we don't have a time machine, and I think we just acknowledge, that, okay, I made a decision. I think admitting the mistake, the difference between what we expected to happen, what actually happened, that's a fact. And I think acknowledging it and calling it out can help normalize that, or take some of the edge off, I think, individually. And then we might try doing that with others and just kind of call out. Let's say, Kenny, if I had been late, let's say if I had the time zone wrong, which I've done before, right? I didn't make that mistake here, thankfully. But, I think just, to call out, oh, I made a mistake. Like, it's kind of pointing out the fact, kind of like we're both wearing black sweaters. That's a fact too.
Mhm.
And, I think admitting it and acknowledging it can help. But then there's the question of how does the other person react
Mm.
to our admission? And now, we come back to workplace culture. One of the most important things for leaders to do if they want their employees to admit mistakes so that we can learn and improve, the leader really has to go first. And when a
Mm.
leader admits a mistake or says they were wrong, we can work through that. But now here's the tricky thing. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, even Kenny. Like if you're in the middle, you might be willing to admit mistakes, and your employees would respect you for that and be willing to admit mistakes. But then if your manager comes down on you and punishes you or yells at you as the middle manager, well, then you're going to learn to keep your mistakes quiet. And then the employees reporting to you are going to learn that same thing. And then again, like we can't learn, we can't improve. That hurts us as an organization.
Yeah, and that was gonna be I'm so glad you brought that up because it, I think sometimes it may sound simplistic, right, Mark, that leaders don't like to admit their mistakes because they're going to look weak in front of their team or whatever, and that is such old school thinking, in my
Mhm.
opinion, right?
Yeah.
But I think it's more than that. It's wow, my boss just came down on me. Now I'm shutting down, and my team is going to see that. Well, wait a second, what happened to this culture of
Mhm.
admitting mistakes
Mhm.
and so well, how do we get past that? I know in my past I've had to compartmentalize what was coming from above in order to take care of my team
Mhm.
in the right way. And I have to tell you that was difficult at times because
Mhm.
we're human. So
Yeah.
what are some tips to get past that?
Yeah. I mean, that's the difficult thing of being in the middle. I think a lot of what's needed to have a culture, a consistent and aligned culture of admitting and learning from mistakes, it really does start at the top. Now, if we're not the one at the top, or if we're not part of an ownership group or a senior leadership team, that's tough. But I just point to so many examples where, for example, a software company, KaiNexus, that I'm involved in, and there's a lot of their stories, our stories in the book. A lot of it really starts with the CEO and co-founder, Greg Jacobson, who admits mistakes. He's willing to admit he was wrong, or even proactively. And I think this is, kind of like a confident humility to be able to say,
Mm,
even, I might be wrong. I have an idea, but I might be not completely correct. So please challenge me on that. Or to say, as an executive, I have an idea. I could be wrong. Like, this isn't false humility, but it's just saying, well, let's go test that idea
mm,
even in a small way before we plow forward with it. Like, I think that's a healthy skepticism of your own idea, if you will. When leaders are willing to do that, then those leaders in the middle are both following the lead of their executive and then leading to their team members, right? So
mm,
that the ideal situation is, that middle manager um, being able to be aligned with both their executives and their team members,
mhm.
leading by example, and then reacting well when the people working for you admit mistakes. But if you're caught in the middle, and you can try to, like you said, shield your team from somebody up above you. I think, like you were saying, Kenny, sometimes you as a middle manager, you end up taking some lumps
Yeah.
to protect your team, and
Yes.
it's not ideal.
Yes.
And people might get burned out on that.
Yeah, absolutely. All of that advice is so priceless, and it's so vital because in this time of business where we're trying so many different things, people are trying different things. You're gonna fail. You're gonna make some mistakes.
Mhm.
I want to go down this road, and because you mentioned this earlier, and I loved it as I read about you and I listened to a couple of your podcasts and watched them. Systemic factors versus human error.
Mhm.
That is, I mean, there were times where I know I made big blunders because I was just following what was in front of me, right? I was following what the company policy was or whatever. Um, and it was sometimes hard to differentiate through those. And every once in a while, I would have a leader that said, "Hey, man, that wasn't you. That's broke. That system there is broke." Talk about that, and how can leaders really work hard to recognize that in order to, take their employees sometimes off the hook and lift them back up.
Yeah, there's a couple situations, there's bad outcomes and then there's mistakes that lead to bad outcomes. So I think one example of a systemically bad outcome would be you having some sort of bad business result. I don't know, think in terms of a restaurant. I just cook recreationally, but let's say a dish goes out to a customer and they hate it and they're upset and they want their money back and they post a 1-star review. Let's say the chef or whoever's working in the kitchen followed the recipe and executed the recipe well, and the customer just hated it. Like, how would you blame the chef if they were just executing someone else's recipe? Why
Mhm.
would you blame them for that? Now, if the chef created the recipe and executed it flawlessly, well, that's a different level of, I might call that a mistake then, unless that one customer was just an outlier and you realize, well, you can't please everybody. And then there would be, an execution mistake of, like, I think we had a group over for New Year's Eve dinner and different people were cooking in our kitchen, and somebody came over, was preparing something, and she grabbed a canister and she said, "This is salt, right?" Now, thankfully, she asked that before she went to go dump it into the pot of water because it was actually sugar.
Oh,
So that was a mistake averted.
yeah,
But kind of that mix up, or I grabbed cayenne pepper instead of cinnamon.
yeah.
Like, so. You could look and say, well, okay, there was human error. Sometimes people throw their hands up and say, well, gosh, what can I do? Like, well, that's the question, right? What can we do? Like having clearly labeled canisters for one. Like in my kitchen, I know that canister is sugar. I don't label it, but like in a working team environment, you probably would be better off labeling, different ingredients. And even then, there's still the risk that people get distracted or fatigued, or our eyes and our brains play tricks on us. Somebody might grab cayenne pepper thinking they were looking and being careful, and grabbing cinnamon.
Mhm.
So then there are things that we can do systemically. Let's say if we're, I don't know, a kitchen that is making cinnamon rolls as part of a breakfast menu, and we don't want to accidentally make cayenne pepper rolls. Like maybe you make sure literally there is no cayenne pepper in the kitchen if
Period.
that's
Yeah,
not being used
yeah,
for breakfast. I don't know. I mean, I think
yeah.
you need to proactively look and try to understand what mistakes could happen, and instead of just telling people, "Hey, be careful, don't make that mistake." We can put measures in place. This is a great lesson from Toyota, and I write about this in the book. What we call mistake proofing, like trying to build in systems and processes, whether that's checklists or other things in the workplace that help protect people from making an error.
Yeah,
I think we're all better off if we can do that instead of punishing people after the fact.
yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. What you said was great, and it really sparked another question for me, and that's what does this do to innovation, Mark? Like you think about the chef that maybe played around and came up with his own recipe, and oh, hey, that was a mistake, man.
Mhm.
How likely are they to want to try something again? And
Yeah.
so I think this goes back to now the culture that
Yeah.
you talk about. What does this do to innovation?
Well, I mean, punishing innovation mistakes leads to less innovation.
Yes.
And there's one other way of breaking down mistakes. There are, execution errors of whether it's a restaurant or a factory or a hospital, like kind of routine procedures, giving medications to a patient. We know if we do these things the right way with certain checks in place, we won't give the wrong medication to a patient. Like there are certain execution mistakes like that we should be working really, really hard to prevent. But when it comes to improvement or even innovation, you have to expect that everything, it's not possible for everything that we try to be a success. And if that's the bar that we set, say, well, you can only try a new recipe if it's a hit. Well, people are going to be really, really cautious
Mm.
in what they try. And I think this is true in different types of workplaces. So I think there are ways of mitigating the risk of a mistake. You look at big corporations, chains or franchise operations. I don't think they ever just roll out a brand new menu item nationwide all in one fell swoop. They do
No.
test markets. They
Yeah.
they have test kitchens. Then that you have test markets and test stores. And I think one way of mitigating that mistake is small tests of change.
Mm.
If you're going to I guess fail. If you're going to fail early, fail small
Hmm.
rather than failing big. And I think just having that first recognition, I might be making a mistake, leads us to then go test our ideas. And there's a balance, right, of not being overly cautious,
Yeah.
and not being overly risky. But going and testing ideas on a small scale
Hmm.
is usually helpful. There's always a risk that that small scale test is misleading one way or another.
Yeah.
So I think we just have to maybe, keep increasing the size of our tests. And I think I've interviewed people on the My Favorite Mistake podcast, and a lot of their stories are in the book, The Mistakes That Make Us. Again, like you just have to expect that some of these ideas are going to be stinkers.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in a way, maybe even, some companies even celebrate that as
Yeah.
a way of reinforcing to people, whether it's software or new menu items or new products or new services. We certainly do our best to succeed, but if we don't recognize that there's going to be mistakes and failures, that ends up holding us back. So I think we have to strike that balance of,
Yeah.
again, like not just wildly throwing stuff against the wall, but
Yeah.
being a little bit more intentional and scientific in terms of doing a small test and evaluating it, and deciding, do we pivot or persevere when we
Yeah.
think, okay, gosh, this isn't quite going as well as we had thought.
Yeah. I love it. And it takes that culture from within to continue to move forward. As I was preparing to talk to you, I wanted to throw a real life scenario at you that you probably saw on the news. And I just was like, I wonder what Mark thinks about this. So we probably saw on the news where there's an airline, I don't remember what airline, I wouldn't name it anyway, but a 6-year-old boy traveling by himself got sent to the wrong city. Huge mistake, right? That
Yeah.
poor 6-year-old boy was probably traumatized. The parents, I can't imagine that. Um, and I think people were waiting and waiting for the airline for a response. And the airline's response was, well, we're not sure what happened, but we fired the employee.
Mm,
And I just was wondering
mm,
and we don't know behind the scenes what they're
right.
doing or whatever, but I just felt like, wow, firing the employee, that really solved it, right? Firing the employee. What was some of your thoughts if you've already heard that story or just hearing it just now? Because that's a major
Yeah.
mistake, but
Yes.
how do you, I mean, what do you do from that?
Yeah, I saw the headline. I didn't dig deeper. I certainly don't know the cause of it. But what you point to, Kenny, is, I think, sadly far too common, where the company says the person responsible has been fired. And
Mhm.
is it really as simple as, quote unquote, the person responsible? I mean, usually it's not. And so then, we've got the challenge now of human nature or society. Do we sort of like we either crave or accept punishment as an answer? It on some
Yeah.
level it sounds good, but I'm like, well, that's retribution. That's not necessarily improvement. I've just heard far too many stories from companies where employee number one gets fired for, quote unquote, making that mistake. And I put that in quotes because it's usually not that simple. They fire that employee, do nothing else to improve the operations, bring in employee number two, and it's probably a matter of time
Yeah.
before that mistake occurs again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just it sounds on one level like, oh well, we're taking responsibility as the company because we fired that person. I'm like, well, I don't know if you're really taking responsibility,
No.
for
No.
I don't know what the factors were, but
Yes.
you know
Yeah.
what there are supposed to be a lot of checks and balances, and
Yes.
there's a methodology that's often credited to Toyota. We talk about the five whys of like just keep asking why, not always five, but keep asking why. So like, how does a child or any passenger get onto the wrong flight? They're supposed to be scanning boarding passes, and in the year 2023 or coming into 2024, I've almost in some airports it's very confusing. There's a bunch of gates all right
Yeah.
next to each other.
Yeah.
And I've gone up and I've been at the wrong gate because they were boarding two flights at the same time. And they scan that barcode and they're like, oh, Mr. Graban, no, you're actually over here at 57B, not 57A. I'm like,
Yeah. Happened
oh,
to me
right.
too. Absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah.
there are supposed to be systemic factors in processes and technologies that would prevent that mistake. So then you ask, well, if somebody didn't scan the barcode, maybe it's not just so simple as like, oh, that employee wasn't doing their job. Like, was the system being finicky? Was the technology giving them fits? What was the backup plan or backup system not working well? Was there a lot of time pressure? Like,
Yeah.
I think when organizations put employees under time pressure, whether it's at a gate in an airport or an operating room, more bad things are going to happen. So like,
No
let's
doubt.
not pressure people on metrics and, telling them you have to have a certain percentage of on time flight departures or you're going to be punished. I mean, there's different factors there. So I'm not trying to say, nobody should ever be held accountable for anything, but I think the balance, the tipping, the pendulum, I think, has swung too far towards punishing individuals for systemic factors. We can let that pendulum swing maybe back in the other direction and say, look, if somebody was intentionally like there's a matter of intent here, not just was it a bad outcome.
Mhm.
Was there intent to send that child to the wrong city? Probably
Right.
not.
Probably not. Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, you broke that down perfectly, and we need to make you the CEO of that airline for
No
sure. That
thanks.
I and I love that you said it. Just that just shifts blame. All right,
Yeah,
this has been amazing. I've got one last question for you, and then I want you to please talk about how people can connect with you and get your books.
sure.
Um, it, in your experience now, Mark, how much how much does this baggage come from home, from upbringing, and does that make it more difficult to change? I'm just so blessed that I had terrific parents.
Mhm,
My dad was never that hard on me when I messed up, but he let me know about it. But
mhm.
I was able to come back. I had a safe space to come back to.
Yeah.
There are a lot of homes that aren't like that.
Sure.
And so how does that play into, especially when someone now moves into leadership and it's just so ingrained in their home culture?
Yeah, I mean, and I say that, I say this not as a psychologist, but like thinking of my own life experiences and talking to others about this. Yeah, I mean, there's differences in our upbringing in home, through the education system, some of the first jobs that we have in the workplace. So yeah, I mean, there is that combination of different factors. And I think one key takeaway, and I've seen this happen a lot within the context of KaiNexus, the software company I'm involved in. When people join the company, and KaiNexus has a very strong culture of admitting mistakes and learning from mistakes, that's very that can be challenging for a new employee. And I think we've learned if somebody joins the team and they can be told this is our culture and these are the expectations, they're still they have that maybe internalized fear
Yeah.
that could come from their upbringing, their education system, other jobs. And we've learned, don't blame that person for being afraid to speak up. You just have to demonstrate over time that it is safe
Yes.
to do so. You can demonstrate that. And somebody can't just flip a switch and say, "Oh, I am in a safe environment now."
Yeah,
They
none of
have
that.
to
Yeah.
have it demonstrated and convince themselves, and it can take time. But I think when again people see the CEO and they're the middle manager they report to admitting mistakes and positives come out of it, that helps. Right. And then they might take that baby step of saying, you know what, they might have trouble spitting out, like, I made a mistake. And when that gets a positive, constructive response,
Yes.
that helps bring them along to say, oh, okay, it is different here.
Yeah.
And it's better, and I'm going to help sustain that culture. And if they move on to another organization where they're a leader, hopefully they have the opportunity to help cultivate that type of culture in a different workplace as well.
Yeah, yeah, I love that advice, and it's tough. We just don't know where people have come from these days, and
Yeah.
I suppose we need to find out a little bit more as we have them on board. Amazing, amazing stuff, Mark. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. This has just been so eye opening and so illuminating for me, and I know it's going to be for a lot of people. How can people connect with you and learn more about you? I know you've got a terrific podcast. I'm recommending it 100%. Guys, listened, and you bring some guests on as well, and it's very very informative.
Thank
But how else can people connect with you, and how can they listen to your podcast and get your books?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for asking that. So the podcast is My Favorite Mistake. It can be found wherever you're listening to us right now. My Favorite Mistake. The book is The Mistakes That Make Us. The website for that is mistakesbook.com. They can also find the podcast through mistakespodcast.com. The book is available through Amazon and other booksellers. It's available in print form, Kindle, and other ebook formats. There's an audiobook version that's available through Audible and Apple. And then my general website is markgraban.com.
Awesome. Awesome. We'll have all that there, Mark. And folks, I want to recommend, please, please, because we really just scratched the surface. There's so much more that you can learn from Mark's work and so many other different aspects of leadership and other things. So, Mark, thank you so much again for your time, for being flexible, being so generous with your time today. It's just been an honor to be able to talk to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Kenny. I appreciate your interest in this and your questions. And I hope any mistakes I made along the way were just small ones.
You're forgiven. Don't worry about it, man. Come on.
Thank you.
We'll leave it there, folks. This has been Kenny and Mark. This has been the Leading from the Middle podcast. We'll talk to you real soon.